The first lesson was that life is suffering. You are 5 years old and already you know this world is not gentle. Your feet are bare on the cold stone floor, your hands red and raw from the winter wind. There is a lesson whispered in every shadow and carved into every wrinkle of your parents' faces. Life is suffering. You hear it in the prayers muttered before dawn, in the stories told by candlelight, in the warnings hissed by elders who survived too much loss to believe in mercy. This is not a world that promises happiness. It promises endurance. From the moment you can speak, you're taught that pain is not an exception, but the rule. The village priest reminds you that earth is a fallen world, corrupted by ancient sin, where every joy is paid for with hardship. The adults tell you not to laugh too loudly, not to trust a day of warmth, because suffering is always waiting on the horizon. Your mother's lullabies carry more caution than comfort. Songs about the saints who bled and the sinners who burned, about how even paradise can vanish in a single night. It is the first lesson of medieval childhood, and it arrives early. By 5, you are already expected to help. You carry water, gather wood, mind your younger siblings, and chase away stray dogs. If you complain, you're told to be grateful. Others have it worse. Pain is a part of growing up. Hunger is a companion, not a surprise. You learn to ignore the ache in your belly, the blisters on your palms, the chill that creeps into your bones. Suffering is not a curse but a test, and every adult seems to be grading your endurance. At church, you listen to stories of martyrs, children not much older than you who met death with a song on their lips, saints who found glory through agony. The message is clear. The sooner you accept pain, the better chance your soul has in the next world. Heaven is for those who endure. Joy in this life is fleeting and dangerous, a temptation to pride, an invitation for fate to strike you down. If you are too happy, something is sure to go wrong. So you learn to be cautious with your smiles, to savor small pleasures quietly, as if hiding them from the jealous eyes of fate. Even play is tinged with risk. Games are rough, laughter quick to end in tears. An accident, an ankle twisted in a ditch, a cut from a sharpened stick, can mean more than a day's discomfort. Infection lurks in every wound. Sometimes you see a child vanish from the village, carried away by fever, the sound of wailing parents echoing long after the tiny coffin is lowered into the earth. No one asks why God allows it. They simply endure, the lesson burned deeper into their hearts. The stories the elders tell are not fairy tales but warnings. The boy who disobeyed and was lost to the forest. The girl who wasted bread and brought famine to her home. The family who dared to celebrate too wildly, only to lose everything in a fire, a raid, a sudden storm. Every narrative teaches humility, endurance, and the certainty that suffering is not only inevitable, but meaningful. To survive is to be worthy. Sometimes you dream of another world, a place where happiness lasts, where pain is rare and kindness easy. But even your dreams feel dangerous, and you wake knowing you must not wish too hard. Hope is a kind of rebellion, and you are not allowed rebellion. You keep your head down, do your chores, pray for mercy, and wait for tomorrow, knowing it may bring more hardship. And yet, within this harshness, there is a kind of solidarity. The whole village knows the same suffering. When a neighbor loses a child, the others gather, sharing what little food they have, weeping together beneath the shadow of the church. When sickness comes, it is endured together. Pain becomes the glue that binds you to your family, your neighbors, your God. Everyone suffers, so no one out is truly alone. You learn to find meaning in small mercies. A warm loaf of bread, a day without rain, the rare smile from a tired parent. These become treasures. You discover joy in moments so brief you almost miss them. A bird's song, the rush of cool water from the well, the safe return of your father from a distant field. You are taught to be humble in your happiness, to never boast, to expect loss even in the midst of plenty. Education for most is not letters or numbers, but the ability to endure. The world outside the village is filled with rumors of plague, war, famine, each a test sent by God. Survival is a virtue, and childhood is only the first trial. Some children do not survive, and their absence is a silent warning. Be strong, endure, or be forgotten. You come to believe, as everyone around you does, that suffering refines the soul. The harder the life, the greater the hope of heaven. Your worth is measured not by how much you enjoy, but by how much you can withstand. Parents who love their children teach them not to seek comfort, but to prepare for hardship. The happiest children are not the most sheltered, but the most resilient. As you grow older, the lesson does not fade. It deepens. You take on more work, shoulder more loss, and see the lines of sorrow etched into faces that once seemed unbreakable. The wisdom of the village is always the same. Do not expect happiness, expect hardship, and you will never be disappointed. And still, something remarkable happens. Within this life of suffering, you discover a strange and stubborn hope. Not the hope of comfort or pleasure, but the hope that comes from surviving another day, from outlasting the worst the world can throw at you. You learn that endurance itself is a kind of victory, and that the fleeting moments of joy are made sharper, more precious, because of what surrounds them. This is the world you inherit, a world that tells you, from your very first lesson, that life is suffering. But it is also a world where suffering binds, refines, and, in rare moments, gives birth to the small, fierce joys that make life worth living, even in its darkest hours. Death was always watching, and God was always judging. In the medieval world, fear was not an occasional visitor, it was a constant companion. Death watched from every shadow, and God, it was said, saw into every secret corner of your heart. For the children of Europe's villages, this reality was not just taught, it was lived. Long before science, long before hope or explanation, there was only the certainty of the grave and the terror of damnation. Every day was a lesson in survival, and every story whispered by firelight was a reminder that the soul was always at risk. Childhood as we imagine it today, a time of innocence, curiosity, gentle dreams, was instead marked by warnings, threats, and prayers, each designed to keep the young from stepping too close to sin or too far from obedience. Imagine a child awakening to the tolling of the church bell, the sky still gray with mist. Before breakfast, the family kneels together, heads bowed as a parent intones a prayer for protection, not just from hunger or sickness, but from the temptations of the devil. Every misstep, every careless word was believed to be weighed on a cosmic scale. Even stray thoughts, if they wandered toward envy or anger, could tip a soul who was closer to hell. Children learned that God was not just a distant, loving father, but an omnipresent judge whose gaze could never be escaped. The walls of every church were painted with lurid visions of the afterlife, angels weighing souls, demons dragging the condemned by their hair into fires that burned without end. Monks and priests told stories of children snatched to hell for a single lie, or cursed for breaking the Sabbath, or doomed to wander as ghosts because of an unconfessed sin. There was no comfort in the idea of a gentle death. Plague, famine, war, and accident were as common as the changing of the seasons. A fever in the night, a cough in the winter, a sharp pain in the belly. These were omens. Parents lost children with such regularity that prayers for the dead became as familiar as lullabies. And yet, the terror was not only of death itself, but of what lay beyond. To die without confession, to perish with sin on the soul, was to be cast into an eternity of torment. Children were told again and again that nothing escaped God's attention. A stolen apple, a rude gesture, a wicked thought, each could open the gates to hell, a place described in the most graphic detail. Preachers painted pictures of writhing bodies, burning skin, endless screaming, rivers of fire, devils with hooks and claws. This was not metaphor, it was education, drilled into children's minds before they even learned to read. For many, fear became the greatest teacher. Parents and elders invoked death and damnation to keep order, to hold families and villages together against the chaos of disease, hunger, and violence. God is watching you, they would say, when a child hesitated at a task or drifted into disobedience. Death could come tonight, whispered in the dark, became a lullaby twisted into a threat. It was not unusual for children to witness death up close, to see bodies carted through muddy streets, to hear the wails of parents mourning at gravesides. Cemeteries were not distant or hidden, but nestled among the homes and churches, a daily reminder that every life, no matter how cherished, ended the same way. Funerals were public affairs, attended by all, often featuring sermons that described hell in such detail that children wept in terror, clutching their mothers for comfort. But fear did more than keep children obedient. It shaped their imaginations, their dreams, their understanding of the world. Even the simplest games were haunted by the specter of judgment, playing at heaven and hell, imitating the Last Judgment, reciting stories of saints who outwitted the devil, or sinners who suffered unspeakable fates. The rhythm of the year itself was marked by reminders. Lent, a time of fasting and self-denial, brought tales of Christ's agony. All Souls' Day turned villages into processions of prayer for the lost and damned. Every thunderstorm, every eclipse, every strange illness was seen as a sign, God's displeasure, or worse, his punishment. Children internalize these lessons, learning to watch their own thoughts, to confess even the smallest sins, to pray for forgiveness with trembling lips. Many grew up haunted, seeing death in every shadow and hearing God's judgment in every misfortune. Some rebelled, growing hard and fatalistic, convinced that nothing could change their fate. Others became saints in miniature, obsessively pious, desperate to secure a place in the next world that would be free of suffering. In the most tragic cases, terror of hell drove children to confession after confession, racked by guilt for sins real or imagined. Unable to believe in forgiveness when every adult around them described hell as a certainty for the slightest mistake. This is the hidden legacy of medieval faith, the deep, unrelenting fear that shaped lives from the cradle to the grave. For peasants and lords alike, but especially for the young, the knowledge that death was always near and God always watching was as real as hunger, as present as cold. And yet, even within this atmosphere of dread, there grew a stubborn hope, a belief, however faint, that good deeds could tip the scales, that prayers could open heaven's gates, that even the smallest act of kindness might be seen by the same all-seeing God who judged every sin. Children learned to navigate a world where fear and faith were inseparable, where every day was a test and every dream haunted by visions of fire or angels. So, when we think of childhood in ages past, we must remember the invisible burdens that shaped it. The stories told not just to frighten, but to protect. The images not just to terrify, but to instruct. Death waited in every corner, and God's judgment hung over every thought. In this world, every heartbeat was a prayer for mercy, and every shadow a reminder that the next breath could be the last. The legacy of that fear still echoes, a reminder that even the most innocent lives are shaped by the stories they're told and the terrors they're taught to see. Loyalty to your Lord was holier than loyalty to family. In the world of medieval Europe, where banners fluttered above stone castles and oaths were sealed with blood, a boy's future was shaped not by his father's love, but by a Lord's command. Here, loyalty was not a gentle virtue. It was a sacred bond, etched into flesh and soul, binding every knight, squire, and page to the will of their noble master, often at the cost of everything else, even family. Imagine a boy of 7, his mother's arms trembling as she hands him over to the Lord's household. He's to become a page, a servant in training, the first step on the long, brutal road to knighthood. In the great hall, he learns to serve wine, to carry armor, to read the faces of men who rule over land and life. But more than skills, he is taught the one lesson that matters. Your loyalty to your Lord must be absolute. It must eclipse even the bonds of blood. Older squires, battered by years of discipline, whisper the stories at night. A page who fails his master brings shame not just on himself, but on generations of his family. The boy learns that to die for his Lord is not just duty, but the highest calling, a sacrifice that earns heavenly reward. To turn away, to betray that trust, is a sin that blackens the soul forever. The Lords, themselves products of the same unyielding code, reinforce the lesson at every turn. They remind their young charges that the land is held by divine right. The very order of the world is maintained by this hierarchy. God, king, lord, vassal, peasant. Disobedience is not just a crime, It is a threat to the fabric of the universe. Boys kneel in icy chapels and swear oaths on relics, trembling not with fear, but with the weight of destiny. It wasn't just talk. The medieval chronicles are littered with examples. Boys who turned against their own kin to prove their fealty, sons who rode out against rebel fathers at the Lord's command. Loyalty was tested not just in war, but in the small, grinding moments of daily life. A page who saw his brother steal from the Lord's kitchen was expected to report him, even if it meant a whipping or worse. Tears were weakness. Hesitation was betrayal. For most, there was no choice. Family ties, so sacred in other times and places, became suspect in the shadow of the castle. If your loyalty wavered, the consequences were swift and merciless. A squire who faltered in battle might watch his parents' home seized, his sisters sold to servitude, his family name erased from the rolls. Honor was collective. One person's failure was everyone's disgrace. Over time, this code wormed its way into every part of life. At the dinner table, boys recited the deeds of their lords like prayers. In the tilt yard, every lance shattered in training was a vow. I belong to my master, not to my kin. Even love was suspect. Secret marriages or forbidden romances could cost a boy everything, because nothing, not desire, not blood, not God himself, could come before the oath. There were moments, of course, when the old loyalties clashed. In times of civil war, sons found themselves across the field from fathers, drawn by the iron pull of conflicting allegiances. Letters survive from the period, written in cramped Latin by trembling hands, where boys apologized to mothers, promising to serve well, to bring honor, to dom if called, yet never mentioning family again. The pain is palpable, but the duty is clear. Why did this system endure? For the lords, the answer was obvious. Absolute loyalty guaranteed power. A master could sleep soundly knowing his retainers would face death rather than disobey. For the boys, it was survival. To serve well was to rise, perhaps to win land, gold, and a family of their own someday. To falter was to lose everything, sometimes even life itself. Yet beneath the steel surface, there are glimpses of rebellion. Folk tales whisper of pages who risked all to save a brother, who rode for home instead of following orders, who vanished into the forest rather than betray their blood. These were the outliers, the ones history often forgot or condemned. But in their stories lingers a hidden truth. No code, however strict, can fully erase the call of family. Still, for most, the path was set. The castle was both sanctuary and prison, the Lord both guardian and God. The boy who survived the harshest lessons, who learned to kneel, to serve, to bleed for his master, might one day become a knight, wielding the same power over others. The cycle continued, each generation shaping the next with the same relentless discipline. Centuries have passed, but echoes of that code remain. In every tale of honor, every oath sworn before witnesses, every moment where duty clashes with the heart, we hear the distant voices of boys and men who learned, often painfully, that loyalty to a lord was holier than any tie of flesh. Their sacrifices built kingdoms and toppled dynasties. But in quiet moments, perhaps they wondered what they had lost in the name of honor. This is the truth behind the shining armor and the noble quests. Beneath every hero is a child who was taught that family must come second, and that dying for a master is the only path to true immortality. In the shadows of the castle walls, the cost of loyalty was measured not just in blood, but in the silent ache of those who remembered, even as they knelt, the faces of the ones they left behind. Children practiced their own funerals to prepare for heaven. Imagine a world where the shadow of death hung so heavily over daily life that even children were taught to welcome it. In the cold stone corridors of medieval monasteries and in the humble thatched cottages of distant villages, a strange and somber ritual took hold. One both haunting and, in its own way, full of hope. Here, children as young as 6 or 7 would gather not to play games of knights and dragons, but to rehearse their own funerals. They practiced deathbed confessions, stage processions, and even lay in mock graves, all to learn, before they could even read or write, how to die well. It sounds unthinkable now, yet in a world shaped by war, plague, and the constant presence of mortality, death was not just an end. It was a lesson, a doorway, and above all, a test of faith. For these children, learning to duck was as important as learning to live. The doctrine of the time was clear. Salvation could be won or lost in a person's final moments. A good death meant dying in a state of grace, free from sin, with the right prayers said, the right confessions made. The church taught that those who failed to prepare could face eternal torment, and so the rituals began. Rituals that turned childhood itself into a rehearsal for the grave. The practice varied from place to place, but the heart of it was always the same. In monasteries, where orphaned or noble-born boys lived and learned under the watchful eyes of monks, death was a frequent visitor. The Black Death, waves of famine, and outbreaks of fever swept away young lives in terrifying numbers. To prepare the living, the brothers would guide the children through every stage of a holy death. The children took turns lying on beds, draped in white sheets, hands folded, eyes closed, as their classmates and teachers surrounded them, chanting prayers for the dying. They would listen as one child confessed their sins, usually simple mischief or imaginary transgressions, while another played the priest, offering absolution. The ritual did not end there. After the death, the body was lifted onto a board or stretcher, sometimes covered with the flowers, sometimes with rough cloth, and carried through the cloisters or across the village, while the others sang the solemn melodies of the requiem. In villages, the traditions were less formal, but just as powerful. Parents, desperate to save their children's souls, encouraged these games of death as a way to teach courage and obedience to God's will. Some communities even organized full mock funerals, complete with tiny processions winding through narrow streets, the children carrying crosses and candles. At the end, the child dead would rise, blessed and congratulated for their bravery. For a moment, the boundary between life and death blurred, replaced by the certainty that both were part of a divine plan. To outsiders, it may seem grim, morbid even, but to medieval people this was an act of love and faith. Childhood was perilous. Few families expected all their children to survive into adulthood. Nearly every boy and girl had lost a brother, a sister, a friend. The fear of dying unprepared haunted the hearts of parents and priests alike. Teaching children to face the end with prayer, calm, and confession was a way to armor their souls against an unpredictable world. It was also a form of control, a way to ensure that, even in the chaos of plague or war, the church's rites would be observed, and no soul would slip through the cracks. Some accounts describe these rituals in vivid, heartbreaking detail. In one monastery, a child named Thomas, barely 8, was chosen to play the dying. As he lay on the cold stone floor, wrapped in a borrowed shroud, the others knelt around him, reciting prayers and singing hymns. When the moment came, the monk in charge sprinkled holy water on the child's forehead and murmured the words of final absolution. For Thomas and his friends, it was both terrifying and comforting. They wept, some out of fear, some out of relief, then rose, hands joined, and walked back into the sunlight, changed in ways they could not fully understand. In another village, a chronicler recorded how, after a terrible winter when sickness claimed half the children, the survivors gathered in the churchyard and reenacted the funerals they had seen so often. Parents watched with hollow eyes as their children carried each other, small shoulders stooped under invisible burdens. It was a game, but one played with the weight of real sorrow. When it ended, there were no winners, only a deep, collective breath, a fragile hope that, when death returned, their children would be ready. For the church, these rituals were a powerful tool. They reinforced the message that no one was too young for salvation or damnation. They bound families to the rhythms of confession, penance, and faith. They made every child's life, in death, a lesson for the living. The prayer spoken over the pretend dead echoed in the minds of those who would one day hear them for real. Yet for the children themselves, something deeper was happening. In learning to face death, they also learned about community, about the love that bound them to their friends and families. They found comfort in ritual, in the knowledge that, whatever happened, they would not be alone. They rehearsed not just for their own ends, but for the ends of those they loved, preparing to comfort and pray for each other in a world where loss was always close. As the centuries passed and medicine improved, these rituals faded from memory, but echoes remain in lullabies, in prayers whispered at night, in the way children are still taught to hope for heaven. The world has changed, but the desire to prepare to find meaning in life and death is as strong as ever. The children who practiced their own funerals left behind a legacy not of fear, but of resilience, a reminder that even in the face of the unknown, the human spirit can find courage and even a strange kind of grace in the rituals that bind us together. Daughters were taught to smile in pain as a divine test. In the stone-cold chambers of medieval homes, in the flickering candlelight of peasant cottages and castle keeps alike, daughters learned their place not from books, but from the soft-spoken rules of survival, rules etched into them by mothers, grandmothers, priests, and fathers. Smile in pain, endure in silence. Suffering, they were told, was not a punishment, but a holy path. God, after all, tested those he loved. From childhood, girls heard it whispered, "A woman's virtue is measured not by her joy, but by her patience. If you weep, weep alone. If you are struck, offer the other cheek and pray." To rebel against pain was to rebel against God's will, to fail the test set before you. Even as children, daughters were taught to lace up their shoes, brush their hair, and fold their hands with quiet dignity, masking their wounds with practiced smiles. Physical pain was woven into daily life, fingers red and raw from spinning wool, arms aching from drawing water, feet blistered from hours in the fields or by the fire. A girl learned to keep her voice low when her stomach growled with hunger in lean seasons. To complain would be to shame her family, to seem ungrateful in the eyes of heaven. God sees you, the old women said, and he loves a soul that does not flinch. But it was not only hunger or hard work. The real trials came with the turning of age when fathers and lords decided their daughters' futures without asking for dreams or desires. Girls, sometimes as young as 12, were promised to men twice their age, often strangers, sometimes neighbors, rarely chosen. On the wedding day, a daughter was adorned in her best dress, her face painted not with joy, but with a careful, unbreakable calm. The pain of separation, the fear of what was to come, all masked behind a gentle, practiced smile. Mothers reminded them, "This is your cross to bear. Accept it bravely, for God counts your tears." There were darker moments, nights when a daughter's body was not her own, when she became a vessel for her family's alliances or her husband's anger. If bruises blossomed on her skin, if the hunger sharpened to sickness, the answer was always the same. Offer it up. The more you suffer, the closer you come to sainthood. The pain was to be transformed by force of will into grace. To endure was not just survival, it was a performance of holiness. The church encouraged this quiet martyrdom. Priests preached sermons about the purity of saints, the silent strength of the Virgin Mary, the cleansing fire of suffering. Girls knelt on cold stone floors and prayed for the strength to endure. In confession, they whispered not of anger or injustice, but of impatience and doubt. They learned that longing for relief was a failing, and that the truest love was obedience, to God, to father, to husband. Some found small freedoms in the spaces between these burdens. A kind word from a mother, a sister's shared secret, the fleeting laughter of childhood before it vanished. But even these joys were shadowed by the expectation to bear pain without complaint. Songs sung at dusk were full of longing for a world where kindness did not need to be earned through suffering. To outsiders, these girls often seemed serene, polite, quiet, graceful. But beneath the calm, many harbored storms of fear, anger, and longing. Some broke under the weight, their spirits withering in silence. Others learned to hide not just their pain, but themselves, building invisible walls no one could breach. A few rebelled in small ways, refusing a meal, running to the woods to weep, clinging fiercely to the memory of a lost friend or forbidden love. The cycle endured for generations. Mothers, once daughters themselves, taught their own girls to smile through pain, to see suffering as a sign of being chosen. If God tests you, it means you are worthy. And so the rituals repeated. Girls endured, survived, and sometimes thrived, their strength invisible but unbreakable. Their pain became part of the story of their families, their villages, their country. Centuries later, we look back on these lives and marvel at the resilience required to survive them. The world has changed, but the echoes of these lessons linger in subtle ways. The expectation for women to endure, to smile through adversity, to transform pain into patience. The history of those medieval daughters is not just a record of suffering, but a testament to the quiet, stubborn power that can be born of hardship. In the silence of old stone houses and the whispers of forgotten prayers, you can still hear it. The voices of countless girls who learned, from the very first breath, to smile through the pain, believing each wound was a secret test set by heaven. They endured not because they were weak, but because endurance was the only choice the world allowed them. And though history forgets their names, the memory of their strength and of the suffering they carried with silent, holy smiles still shapes us all. The church showed children paintings of rotting corpses. You are 7 years old, clutching your mother's hand as you step into the cold, echoing darkness of the village cathedral. The air smells of incense and melted tallow, but something else lingers, something sour and ancient, the odor of stone soaked with centuries of prayers and fear. Your heart is pounding, not with awe, but with a dull, crawling dread. Because here, within these holy walls, the world you've been taught to fear takes on a shape you can never unsee. Your eyes are drawn to the walls, high above the flickering candles and solemn saints. Here, where the light barely reaches, are paintings that haunt the mind long after you've left. A mural of rotting corpses, their flesh mottled green and black, eyes gaping and mouths twisted in silent screams. Skeletons dancing with the living, clutching at their cloaks and dragging them down into darkness. Hell opens beneath their feet, flames licking hungrily, demons grinning, the bones of the damned piled high in grotesque heaps. You stare, trying to look away, but the images are everywhere. Along the nave, above the altar, even hidden in the corners where dust gathers and secrets are kept. You try to make sense of it, but there are no explanations, only warnings. The priest's voice echoes from the pulpit. Remember, children, this is what awaits the sinful. This is the price of a careless word, a stolen apple, a moment's disobedience. Heaven may be promised to the pure, but hell is always closer, always waiting. The lesson is clear. Life is a test, and the smallest slip can drag you down forever. These paintings are not there to comfort, but to terrify. Medieval Europe is a place obsessed with death. The Black Death has swept through villages like a ghost with a scythe, leaving behind silence and fear. Famine follows pestilence. War follows famine. Children die young, and even the lucky ones grow up with graveyards for playgrounds. But here, in the cathedral, the fear is shaped and given a purpose. It is molded into color and line, shadow and bone. The message, you will die, and after death comes judgment. There is no escape, not for the rich, not for the poor, not for the innocent. Only the good, the obedient, the penitent will be saved. You look closer at the images, searching for hope, but there is little comfort here. A fat bishop lies dead, gold coins spilling from his open jaw. A proud knight's armor rusts as worms crawl through his hollow eyes. Even children are painted among the damned, pulled from their mother's arms by skeletal hands, flung into flames with expressions of terror frozen on their faces. The message is inescapable. No one is too young to be judged. Adults say it's for your own good. They say you must learn early before sin takes root. They say these images will keep you from temptation, keep you safe. But what you feel is not safety. It is a coldness that seeps into your bones and follows you home. At night, you dream of skeletons creeping from the cathedral halls, whispering your name, counting your secrets. Even outside the cathedral, the fear persists. Every funeral is a warning. The church bell tolls, and you see the faces of the mourners, gaunt, hollow-eyed, as if already halfway to the grave themselves. The priest leads processions past the murals, reminding everyone, especially the children, that flesh is fleeting, that all are dust, and that death comes without warning. The adults speak in hushed tones of the dance of death, the danse macabre, a motif painted across Europe's cathedrals and cloisters. Skeletons lead kings and beggars alike in a grisly procession, reminding us all that status, beauty, and youth are powerless before the grave. Even the happiest festival can end with a glimpse of death's grinning skull peering from the church wall. You learn early and deeply that joy is dangerous, that laughter is fragile, that at any moment your fate could shift from sunlight to shadow. The church wants you to remember always that your soul is on a knife's edge, that sin brings not only earthly punishment, but eternal torment. Every misstep echoes forever. Every temptation is another bony finger pointing your way. Some children are scarred for life, never able to forget the horror. Others become numb, their hearts hardening into stone, faith forged in terror rather than love. A few learn to look for hope, even here, to search for the tiny figures of saints and angels hidden among the bones, to listen for the whispered promises of forgiveness. But for most, childhood is lived in the shadow of these murals. You grow up fearing death, fearing bone, fearing yourself. The power of these images lingers for generations. Even centuries later, the paintings fade, but the fear remains, a lesson carried in memory, passed down in stories, echoed in lullabies meant not to comfort, but to warn. Medieval childhood is shaped not by the promise of heaven, but by the certainty of hell. The church ensures that, before you can even read, you know what awaits the sinful. Rotting corpses, skeletons, the flames of damnation. These are the alphabet you learn before any other. This is how a society teaches obedience, not with gentle words, but with terror, not with trust, but with nightmares painted on sacred walls. And when you close your eyes at night, you do not dream of angels, but of bones and darkness, and the long, cold silence that waits for those who stray. Disobedient children were told. They'd hear angels crying. Imagine growing up in the shadow of ancient abbeys, where every whisper echoed beneath cold stone arches and the air itself seemed heavy with prayers and secrets. In the world of medieval childhood, fear and wonder mixed together in stories spun by adults who had survived famine, plague, and war. For many children, discipline was not simply about rules or respect, but about their very souls. There were lessons harsher than any punishment, warnings that echoed through the dormitories at night. Every time you lie, every selfish act, every careless cruelty, angels begin to graffiti, and if you listen closely, you'll hear them weeping in your dreams. In a time before science and psychology, such tales became the invisible chains that shaped hearts and minds from the inside out. Within the walls of monasteries and abbeys, the education of children was both a privilege and a relentless ordeal. These institutions promised salvation and knowledge, but they traded in fear as much as in faith. Children rose before dawn to the tolling of bells, their first thoughts a silent inventory of yesterday's mistakes, because every action was measured not just by parents or priests, but by the eyes of heaven itself. The world was full of invisible witnesses, saints and devils, and most painfully, uncles, whose sorrowful tears fell for every disobedient child. The message was delivered with a precision meant to strike deep. Sin was not only a mark against the soul, but a source of divine heartbreak. In stories told by flickering candlelight, angels hovered at the edge of every deed, watching with radiant eyes that filled with tears at the slightest slip into selfishness or deceit. Some abbots and nuns described the weeping of angels as an actual sound, soft and mournful, drifting through the corridors at night, a warning to restless or rebellious hearts. Children were told that if they woke in the dark and heard gentle sobs or distant, echoing wails, it was not their imagination. It was heaven itself mourning for their failings. And so guilt became a language as familiar as prayer. Each act of disobedience, however small, was multiplied by the knowledge that it hurt the very beings who were supposed to protect and guide. Children lay awake in narrow beds, straining to hear the weeping that adults insisted would come. Was that the wind, or an angel sobbing for a stolen piece of bread, for a cruel word whispered to a friend, for a lie told in the hope of escaping punishment? Even dreams offered no escape, because the judgment of heaven extended beyond waking hours. Some abbeys taught that the soul was weighed not only by actions, but by thoughts and by what the heart carried into sleep. If you sinned and did not repent before closing your eyes, you might find yourself judged before the angels while you dreamed. witnessing their tears, feeling the sting of their disappointment long after morning broke. The effect of these stories was profound and lasting. For some, it built a lifelong sensitivity, a conscience that trembled at the thought of causing pain, even to beings never seen. For others, it instilled a dread so deep it colored every relationship, with parents, with teachers, even with themselves. Children became skilled at self-surveillance, monitoring their own impulses and shaming themselves for the smallest failures. A harsh word or minor theft could haunt them for weeks, their dreams invaded by the image of weeping angels, their waking hours heavy with fear of invisible witnesses. Yet, behind the sorrow, there was another layer of control. Medieval society needed obedience, not just for order, but for survival. The constant threat of divine sadness kept children docile, hesitant to rebel, quick to confess. Adults believed they were shaping souls for heaven, but often they were teaching children to fear themselves, to mistrust their own hearts, to see even private desires as the seeds of cosmic tragedy. At its worst, the doctrine of the crying angels left children isolated within their own minds, convinced that their secret struggles were watched, measured, and mourned by beings whose love always came mixed with disappointment. Still, some children resisted or reinterpreted the stories. In rare moments of courage, they whispered to each other in the dark, wondering whether angels could also laugh, whether forgiveness was real, whether God's messengers might understand childish mistakes. A few learned to cloak their doubts, nodding at sermons but quietly questioning the truth behind the tears. These silent rebellions were rarely spoken of, but they became part of the tapestry of growing up, a test of not just obedience but of imagination and resilience. The stories of angels weeping for children's sins remain a haunting echo of a world where faith was sharpened when fear and morality was taught through terror as much as hope. They reveal a time when every lie, every selfish impulse, became the stage for an invisible drama, with celestial beings cast in the roles of both comforter and judge. For generations, children carried the weight of these stories, searching for comfort in prayer, seeking forgiveness in the dark, and learning, sometimes painfully, sometimes beautifully, that the hardest battles are often fought in the quiet of the mind, beneath the gaze of the unseen. So when you think of childhood in the shadow of abbeys and monasteries, remember the deep hush that fell at night, the stories that shaped the silence, in the sound, real or imagined, of angels crying for every secret sorrow, every hidden rebellion, every moment a child tried, and sometimes failed, to be good. The nighttime prayer that made children fear sleep. Imagine darkness settling over a medieval village. The candles gutter low, the fire in the hearth gives off its last flickers, and outside the thick wooden shutters, the world is all shadow and silence. A mother kneels beside her child's straw-filled bed. The child's eyes are wide, searching the gloom for whatever might be lurking. Wolves, spirits, sickness, the things that creak and whisper just beyond sight. But before sleep can come, there is one last ritual to face, the nighttime prayer. Now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. The words fall softly, recited by tiny voices, barely more than a whisper. But the comfort is thin, a paper shield against a world that never felt safe after sunset. In the flicker of that prayer is an admission that terrifies. Tonight, you may not wake. Every evening, children were told to prepare for the possibility that their last day had come. If you should die before you wake, you must be ready to be judged. In the modern world, bedtime is a promise of peace, of gentle stories and soft lullabies. But for centuries, night was an enemy, an unknown that devoured the careless and the unlucky. Sickness swept through villages in the dark hours. Fires sometimes smoldered and spread while families slept. Raiders and wild animals prowled the night. Even the air seemed different, colder, heavier, haunted by the fear of things no prayer could entirely keep away. For a child, that fear became ritual. Each night, the familiar words were a reminder. Life was fragile, death was close, and only God's mercy stood between a sleeping soul and the unknown. Some children whispered the prayer with real urgency, hoping that if they spoke it perfectly, nothing bad would happen. Others, too young to understand, simply repeated what they were told, absorbing the dread and the trembling of their parents' voices. Parents believed the prayer was a shield, a kind of spiritual insurance against tragedy, but it also served as a warning. Children were taught that sleep was a kind of rehearsal for death. If I should die before I wake, not when but if, death was random, capricious. Even the innocent could be taken. It was a lesson meant to teach humility and obedience, to remind everyone, child or adult, that each day might be their last. This fear was not unfounded. Plagues could sweep through without warning, taking the healthiest children in a single night. In winter, a sudden fever or a house fire could claim a life while the village slept. The church bells that rang in the morning were both a reassurance and a roll call. If you heard them, you'd survived another night. So children lay awake, eyes darting in the darkness, clutching ragged dolls or thin blankets, hearts beating fast with the thought that this might be the night their soul would be called. For some, the prayer became a kind of magic charm. Say it right, and maybe you'd be spared. For others, it was a constant anxiety, a nightly confrontation with the possibility of never waking up again. The adults tried to soothe the fear with stories of angels watching over sleeping children, but even those tales carried a double edge. Angels, after all, came to carry souls away. And heaven, as comforting as it was supposed to be, was still a distant, uncertain promise compared to the warmth and closeness of family in the here and now. Yet in this ritual, there was also a kind of resilience. Children learned to face their fears early, to make peace with uncertainty. They became intimately aware of life's fragility and learned to find moments of comfort, whether in a parent's touch, a familiar prayer, or the promise that, even if the night took them, they would not go alone. For generations, this nightly prayer shaped the way children understood the world. It made them cautious, reverent, sometimes timid, but also perhaps braver than we can know. To speak of death every night and still close your eyes requires a quiet kind of courage, the ability to hope in the face of uncertainty, to trust in something greater even as the shadows press in. The world has changed, but the words linger. Parents still whisper them, sometimes out of tradition, sometimes out of a deeper need to connect with those who came before. But the old fear has faded, replaced by gentler rituals. The lessons, however, remain. Each night is a reminder. Life is fragile. Tomorrow is not promised. And in the silence between waking and sleep, all we can do is hope that we are kept, safe, remembered, and if the worst should happen, ready. So when you hear that simple prayer, "Now I lay me down to sleep," listen for the echoes of 1,000 years of fear and faith. It is more than a rhyme. It is a window into a world where children face the darkness every night, armed with nothing but hope, a prayer, and the uncertain promise of another dawn. Loyalty to the church was drilled harder than reading. In the silent dawn of a medieval village before the roosters crow, a different kind of schooling began. A lesson etched not in ink, but in the marrow of every child's bones. Loyalty to the church, absolute and unquestioned, was taught with a rigor that overshadowed anything that would ever happen in a classroom. Before a child learned to write their name and or count their family's sheep, they were drilled in the catechism, made to confess their sins, and taught to kneel with bowed heads before the altar. In a world where survival itself was uncertain, spiritual obedience became the one unchanging law. Imagine the life of a peasant child, their days shaped by labor and prayer. There were no school bells, no neat rows of benches, no books waiting to be read. Education for most did not mean learning to decipher Latin texts or craft fine letters with a quill. It meant memorizing the Lord's Prayer, the Hail Mary, and the Apostles' Creed long before understanding the meaning of the words themselves. These sacred formulas were repeated until they became as natural as breathing, woven into the rhythm of every day. The voice of the priest, stern and unwavering, rang louder than that of any parent or elder, reminding each child that their soul belonged first and foremost to God, and by extension, to the church. The church's reach was absolute, touching every home and every heart. Its rituals were the milestones of life: baptism in infancy, confession in childhood, communion in adolescence, and the final rites in old age. From their earliest memories, children were led into the candlelit hush of the church nave, taught to fear the mysterious power of the sacraments in the ever-watchful eyes of saints peering down from painted glass. To obey the priest was to obey God. To question doctrine was not just foolishness, but spiritual danger, risking the fires of hell and the heartbreak of excommunication, which meant being cast out from the only world they knew. In place of primers and alphabet charts, there were catechisms, call and response recitations, drilled daily. Who made you? God made me. Why did God make you? To know, love, and serve him in this world. Even before children could form the letters of their own names, they could recite these answers by heart, sometimes standing in front of the entire congregation, trembling under the gaze of neighbors and kin. The church believed fiercely that obedience must come before knowledge, faith before facts, humility before curiosity. Confession was not reserved for adults. Children were taught to examine their consciences, to list even the smallest sins, a stolen crumb, a harsh word, a lie told in fear. The confessional, with its shadowy curtains and the low voice of the priest, was a place of awe and terror. The act of kneeling, of admitting guilt, of asking for forgiveness, was supposed to mold a soul as surely as the smith shaped iron. In some villages, the fear of sin and the longing for absolution became the invisible fence that kept children in line. Those who failed to confess or who lied in the presence of God risked not just punishment in this life, but an eternity of suffering in the next. This spiritual training was not just a private affair. It was public, communal, enforced through ritual and reinforced by the eyes of the whole village. On holy days, children would be quizzed by priests, their knowledge of catechism judged before all. Mistakes brought shame, perfect recitation brought pride, and sometimes small tokens, a rosary bead, a blessing, or a scrap of sweet bread. But the real reward was belonging, and the real punishment was isolation. To fall short was to be marked as less faithful, a dangerous label in a society where conformity was a shield against suspicion and disaster. For most, the skills of reading and writing were luxuries, reserved for the rare few, nobles, monks, or the sons of wealthy merchants, who might one day handle the church's accounts or read from its holy texts. But faith, drilled and memorized, was the inheritance of all. The words of the Bible and the stories of the saints were delivered not on the page but from the pulpit, vivid and alive in the mouths of the clergy. Legends of miracles, of holy martyrdom, and of terrible judgment day filled the imaginations of children who had never seen a book. They learned to fear the devil, to trust in the Virgin's mercy, to repeat the names of the apostles like a charm against disaster. The intensity of this early spiritual education shaped everything. It created generations for whom obedience was second nature, and for whom the church was not just a part of life, but the meaning of life itself. Even for those who would one day rebel, who would question or break away, the foundation was set in childhood, poured like stone. The world beyond the village, beyond the church's reach, was invisible, unthinkable, except in stories of heretics and the damned, whispered as warnings at the edge of the firelight. Yet beneath the fear and the rigor, there was a strange comfort. In a world without certainty, where famine, war, and plague were always close, spiritual obedience promised order, meaning, and hope. A child who could not read the world could at least recite the prayers that held it together. The rhythms of faith became the rhythms of the heart, beating steady even when everything else fell away. For many, the journey to literacy, if it came at all, began only after years spent memorizing prayers and catechisms, confessing sins, and bowing before the altar. The church, after all, was less interested in scholars than in believers, less in scribes than in souls. The price was high, a childhood shaped by obedience, by fear and longing, by the endless repetition of words whose meaning would unfold only much later, if at all. This was the hidden curriculum of the medieval world, a schooling of the soul that left marks deeper than any ink. And as those children grew, many carried that training inside them forever, shaping not just what they believed, but who they were allowed to become. In the end, the church succeeded where few other powers could. It wrote itself not just on parchment, but on the minds and hearts of an entire people. teaching loyalty long before letters and obedience long before knowledge ever had a chance to bloom. Children were taken to public executions to learn justice. Picture a medieval square at dawn, mist curling between wooden houses, the distant toll of a church bell calling the town to gather. It is a day set aside for justice, and everyone knows what is coming. On the edges of the square, children are already pressing close to their mother's skirts or fidgeting on their father's shoulders. Some are only 6 or 7, still clutching scraps of bread, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. This is no ordinary market day. It is the day when the lesson is not read from a book, but carved into memory with blood and fear. What happens to those who break the law? For centuries across Europe, from the muddy crossroads of France to the bustling squares of England and Italy, public executions were a fact of life, a spectacle, a warning, and most chillingly, an education. Justice was not hidden behind closed doors. It was displayed, performed, turned into theater for all to see. Children, even the youngest, were led by the hand through crowds so thick they could barely breathe. Some parents lifted their sons onto their shoulders for a better view, telling them, "Watch well, remember what you see." The condemned, thieves, murderers, rebels, sometimes only hungry souls caught stealing to survive, were paraded through the streets. Children watched as their neighbors spat and hurled insults, as priests walked alongside the doomed, whispering prayers. There was a sense of ritual to it all, the scaffold, the rope, the headsman's axe. Even before the moment of execution, the message was clear. This is justice. This is what awaits those who step outside the bounds of law and faith. For many children, these were their first lessons about power, morality, and the cost of disobedience. They saw men and women made small, stripped of dignity, begging for mercy or standing silent in defiance. They saw the sharp edge of law and the blunt force of public shame. Some wept, some turned away, but others stared, trying to understand how a person who yesterday might have walked these very streets could be transformed into a warning for all to see. Parents rarely offered comfort. Instead, they explained in hushed voices or sharp whispers that this was necessary. God watches all, they said, and justice must be done. Priests spoke of sin and punishment, of the need for order in a world forever teetering on the edge of chaos. Boys and girls were taught that obedience and fear were the roots of safety. The threat was always present. Break the law, anger the wrong man, stray from the path, and you too could be marched to the scaffold, eyes upon you, prayers rising for your soul as the world waited for the end. The spectacle was carefully crafted for maximum effect. The executioner was both feared and respected, a figure who represented the final, unarguable judgment of the community. For the children, his grim presence became a symbol of adult power, capable of ending a life with a single gesture. The act itself was swift, but the memory lingered. Blood on the straw, the dull thump of a head in the basket, the sudden silence before the crowd surged forward to collect souvenirs or to touch the scaffold for luck. There was no escaping these lessons. In towns and villages where life was already fragile, parents wanted their children to understand the dangers of defiance. Some children went home trembling, haunted by nightmares for weeks. Others boasted to friends about how close they had stood, how little they had flinched. For some, the lesson was clear. Obey, be invisible, do not risk what you cannot bear to lose. For others, a dark fascination grew, an understanding that justice was not always about fairness, but about fear, spectacle, and the raw power to decide who lived and who died. Even as the centuries passed, the tradition endured. In some towns, executions were scheduled on market days to ensure the largest possible crowd, including children. Sometimes teachers led entire classes to the gallows, telling their students to look carefully, to take the lesson to heart. Justice was a communal ritual, and children were always at its center, watching, remembering, shaping their sense of right and wrong by what they saw beneath the shadow of the scaffold. Those who grew up with these memories carried them for life. Some became the next generation of magistrates, priests, or executioners, passing down the lessons they had learned in blood and silence. Others rebelled, questioning the justice of a world that taught children by terror. But for most, the memory became a quiet scar, a hidden part of what it meant to grow up in an age when punishment was public and mercy was rare. Today, it is hard to imagine the weight of those moments, the way fear and authority shaped a child's soul. But in the stones of ancient squares, in the faded stories passed from grandparent to grandchild, the echo remains, children pressed into crowds, eyes one and unblinking, learning that in this world, justice was not just something you read about. It was something you watched, something you felt in the pounding of your heart as the lesson unfolded, not in words, but in the irreversible fall of the axe. The graveyard was a classroom for the soul. You are 8 years old and your classroom is a graveyard. There are no high fences, no separate school building. The village priest teaches letters, prayers, and numbers in a lean-to at the edge of the churchyard, where the smell of damp earth and wild herbs mixes with something sweeter, something unmistakable, the lingering breath of death. All around you, the ground is uneven with centuries of graves. Fresh mounds and old, sunken plots crowd together, their stones worn blank by rain and time. There are mornings when you chase your friends between crosses, leaping over half-buried bones, the laughter of childhood echoing between rows of the newly dead. Here, in the shadow of the steeple, the line between life and death is thin as mist. This is not considered strange. The graveyard is not just for the dead, it is for the living too. The priest insists that to learn beside the graves is to learn humility. Every lesson is underscored by a silent warning. Life is short, and the soul is always being tested. At first you're afraid. You hear stories whispered by older children about ghosts who stalk the night, about restless spirits longing for prayers. But the graveyard soon becomes familiar, even comforting. Your feet know every mossy stone, every hollow where wild violets grow. Sometimes the scent of fresh earth after a burial lingers for days. You learn to breathe through your mouth, to look away when a grave is open and the coffin not yet covered. Some days you watch as men lower a neighbor's body into the ground, and then, minutes later, you return to your slate and your alphabet. The lesson is never spoken, but it is always present. Death is not something that happens far away, but something that happens here, all the time. You see the names on the stones, children younger than you, mothers who died in childbirth, men who fell to war or plague. The teacher weaves their stories into the lessons, reminding everyone that a good life is brief and easily lost. To misbehave is to risk not only a scolding, but a warning about the fate of the unrepentant, whose bones lie restless beneath your feet. Recess is not a word you know, but there are breaks between prayers and lessons. You and the others play among the stones, hide behind the church wall, invent games with sticks and pebbles found beside the graves. When a funeral procession approaches, you fall silent, stepping aside to let the living mourn the newly dead. Sometimes, after the mourners leave, you gather around a fresh mound, poking at the loose dirt, daring each other to touch the burial shroud if it peeks through. There is fear, but there is also curiosity. What is death really when it sits beside you every day? The smells are inescapable, the damp of newly dug earth, the sharp tang of candle wax and incense from the church, and, on rare occasions, the sickly sweet scent of decay rising from a grave not deep enough. You learn early to ignore it, to mask it with herbs, to breathe shallowly. The sense of mortality is not abstract. It is physical, ever present. It becomes part of your childhood, woven into your senses as surely as the sound of the church bell or the taste of coarse bread. Sometimes when the priest speaks of heaven and hell, he gestures toward the graves as proof. Here is the result of a life well lived, he says, pointing to a stone adorned with the flowers. Here is the warning, he intones, gesturing to a lonely, untended grave, sunken and forgotten. You are taught that every action in life echoes beyond death, that your soul is watched and weighed. Even in laughter, you sense the weight of eternity pressing in. When a plague comes, the graveyard swells. New pits are dug in haste, and the lesson becomes darker, more urgent. Children cough and disappear, and soon their names are carved into the stones you pass every morning. Fear grows in the village, but so does a kind of stoic acceptance. You learn that life is unpredictable, Death is impartial, and no one is guaranteed tomorrow. Yet there is resilience here, a stubborn refusal to let sorrow smother joy. After funerals, children still play among the graves. Flowers are still picked, wild stories still whispered. You learn to find beauty in small things, the gold of afternoon light slanting across old stone, the pattern of moss creeping over a forgotten name, the comforting sound of familiar prayers spoken, while the world spins quietly above the bones of your ancestors. This education shapes you in ways you do not yet understand. It makes you cautious, yes, but also fiercely alive. You know what loss feels like. You know the value of kindness, of forgiveness, of not wasting a day. You see your parents pray not just for themselves, but for the souls of the dead, asking for mercy, hoping that someone will do the same for them one day. You watch as each new grave is filled, and you realize, in a way that children far from graveyards never do, that one day your bones too will lie beneath the grass. You grow up carrying this knowledge, moving from childhood to adulthood with the graveyard as your constant companion. It teaches you not to take life for granted, to treasure every friendship, every moment of warmth. It teaches you humility, patience, and the small secret hope that your own soul will be remembered kindly when your time comes. In this place, death is not a distant threat or a source of nightmares, but a daily lesson in the value of being alive. The graveyard is your classroom, and its lessons last a lifetime. Quiet, unforgettable, and written not in ink, but in the very earth beneath your feet. Children practiced confession before they knew sin. In the Middle Ages, the journey from innocence to guilt began long before most children even understood what innocence meant. By the age of 7, children were expected to kneel before a priest and speak aloud the wrongs they had done, real or imagined. Confession, that ancient ritual of admitting sins and begging forgiveness, became a weekly lesson, a rite as familiar as mealtime or prayer. But how does a child confess a crime they do not yet comprehend? How do you feel remorse for desires not chosen, for impulses you barely understand? In medieval Europe, these questions were buried beneath layers of ritual and expectation, replaced by a powerful lesson. Guilt comes first, understanding second. Imagine a child, barely tall enough to see over the altar rail, summoned into the dim light of the confessional. The air is thick with incense and the quiet echoes of whispered secrets. For the adults around her, this is an act of grace, a shield against hell, a path to heaven. For the child, it is something else, a puzzle without pieces, a story in which she is always the villain. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," she says, repeating the words as she has been taught. The priest waits, patient but expectant. She searches her memory for a misstep, a forgotten prayer, a moment of jealousy over a friend's toy, a harsh word, a daydream during Mass. If nothing comes, she invents. "I was disobedient. I spoke when I should have been silent. I thought of myself before others." Adults call this humility, but to the child, it feels like failure. By the standards of the church, 7 was the age of reason, the moment when the soul was thought to become capable of moral choice. But in reality, the demands of confession often arrive before true self-awareness. Children were taught to be watchful, to patrol their own thoughts and desires, to suspect even their dreams of harboring evil. The line between fantasy and sin blurred. Did you want a second helping at dinner? That was gluttony. Did you wish harm on a sibling in a moment of anger? That was wrath. Did you imagine running away from chores or lie to avoid trouble? That was deceit. The smallest impulse could be twisted into a crime worthy of confession, and every week the cycle began again. Some priests understood the confusion and fear these rituals sowed. They listened gently, offering comfort and absolution, but others leaned into the drama of judgment. They described hell in vivid detail, warning that even unconfessed thoughts could tip the scales toward damnation. Children learned to fear not only the consequences of their actions, but the contents of their own hearts. In some places, schools and abbeys held public confessionals, with children standing in line, each one straining to remember or invent a reason for guilt. The stories spread: a child who forgot to confess a sin and died suddenly, forever lost; another who lied in confession and suffered nightmares as punishment from God; Shame became as regular as Sunday Mass. The effects ran deep. For many, confession was the first lesson in self-doubt, a ritual rehearsal of guilt that shaped personality and memory. Children grew cautious, hesitant to trust their instincts, quick to see themselves as flawed. Some became obsessively pious, confessing every stray thought, convinced that their souls teetered on the brink. Others grew numb, reciting sins by rote, hearts hardening to the ritual's intended meaning. Yet even those who rebelled could not escape the shadow of the confessional, the constant sense that someone somewhere was watching and weighing every choice. And still, childhood found its ways of resisting. Some children whispered their doubts to each other in the churchyard, laughing about the invented sins, daring each other to confess to impossible crimes. "I turned water into wine," one boy might joke, or "I flew to the top of the cathedral in my dreams." There was a kind of defiant innocence in these acts, a quiet pushback against the pressure to be guilty before one even understood what guilt was. But more often, the ritual became internalized. Even in play, children practiced confession, staging mock tribunals, inventing punishments, making the act of accusation and forgiveness a game with rules no one quite believed, but everyone had to play. The intent behind the system was not purely cruel. Medieval society was built on order, on the idea that sin, like disease, could be controlled if caught early enough. Confession was meant to purify, to make each soul accountable, to draw children into the embrace of the church before the world's temptations took hold. But the unintended consequence was a culture of anxiety, a childhood spent watching one's own mind, learning to doubt happiness, to question desires, to feel guilt for things barely chosen. As centuries passed, the memory of these rituals faded, replaced by new ideas of childhood and freedom. But in the stones of old churches, in the stories handed down from grandparents to grandchildren, the echoes remain. The confessional was not just a place of forgiveness. For many children, it was the first theater of shame, a stage on which they learned to perform remorse, to imagine themselves guilty, and to fear the secrets inside their own hearts. The lessons of those early confessions lingered long after childhood ended, teaching generations to be cautious with joy, wary of their own souls, and always, always ready to whisper, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," even when the only crime was being young and not yet understanding what sin truly meant. Boys were taught to kill without hesitation for their Lord. In the stone corridors of medieval castles, where the echo of boots and distant bells shaped the rhythm of every day, the future of a young boy was forged with fire and fear. To be chosen as a page and then a squire was not a privilege for the gentle. It was an initiation into a world where violence was as ordinary as prayer, and hesitation was a sin that could doom not just yourself, but your family and your master. From the first days, boys were stripped of softness. Their lessons began at dawn, in chill courtyards or dew-soaked fields, where older men barked orders and the sound of steel on wood replaced a mother's lullaby. Loyalty to a banner, a colored scrap of silk or wool, was drilled into their bones until it was more sacred than blood. To serve the Lord was to serve God's own will. Every rival was an enemy of order, every rebel a threat to the world itself. But beneath the ceremonies and pageantry, the reality was far harsher. Pages cleaned weapons and tended horses, yes, but they also watched, wide-eyed, as knights practiced not just the arts of war, but the arts of killing. A squire learned early that battle was chaos, the cries of the wounded, the churn of mud and blood underfoot, the sickening knowledge that mercy could be fatal. Their teachers, knights hardened by a dozen campaigns, made no secret of it. "You strike when ordered," they said, "and you do not stop until told." If an enemy begged, bleeding and broken, the command was clear: finish the task. The logic was cold, but survival depended on it. A wounded foe left alive could rise up later or bring vengeance on the Lord's household. Squires watched as prisoners were cut down, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. The lesson was repeated so often it became instinct. Don't hesitate. Don't question. The banner above you is all that matters. Older boys drilled with blunted blades, then sharpened ones, their knuckles bloodied, their eyes steeled. They practiced killing stabs to the throat, slashing at straw dummies painted with enemy colors. In war games, the rule was simple. Mercy is a weakness. Even surrender could be a ruse, a feint before the dagger. Their masters told stories of noblemen brought low by compassion, of castles lost because a boy could not strike in time. At night, the lessons continued. Around the fire, men shared tales of glory and betrayal, of friends lost because someone hesitated at the wrong moment. Squires who showed doubt were shamed, or worse, sent home in disgrace, their families marked by dishonor. For some, the trauma became armor. Empathy was buried deep, and every emotion but loyalty was seen as a potential flaw. The church, too, played its part. Priests blessed swords and spoke of holy wars, of saints who fought and killed in God's name. They told the boys that a loyal blade was a holy instrument, that purging the world of the Lord's enemies was not just duty, but a path to salvation. Confession could wash away the blood, but only if the deed was done for the right reasons, never for pity, always for the banner. On the field, this training bore bitter fruit. Battles rarely resembled the songs of court minstrels. Instead, they were close, brutal, choking affairs. When a charge broke the enemy and men lay groaning on the ground, it was often the youngest, squires barely into their teens, who were sent to cleanse the battlefield. They moved among the fallen, finishing off survivors. Some wept afterward, some felt nothing, but all learned. This was expected. This was right. If they could not do it, another would. There were moments of rebellion, boys who flinched, who refused, who helped a wounded enemy escape. But those stories rarely ended well. Cowardice was a stain that clung for life, and those who faltered could lose everything. For the vast majority, self-preservation demanded obedience. It was safer to kill than to question, safer to harden the heart than to feel the pain of what you'd become. Why did this world demand such things of its children? For the Lord's, the answer was clear. Survival. In an age of constant war and shifting loyalties, only the fiercest, most loyal warriors could be trusted to defend the house. The chain of command had to be absolute, unbreakable. For the boys, it was the only way to win honor, land, and a future, no matter the cost to their souls. Yet in the quiet moments, the cost lingered. Men who had once been squires sometimes confessed years later to dreams filled with faces of the fallen. Some carried guilt like a hidden wound, unable to speak of the things they'd done in obedience to a banner. Others became the next generation of harsh teachers, passing on the lesson that had been beaten into them. Never hesitate, never doubt, serve your Lord above all. Centuries later, the world remembers the chivalry, the gleaming armor, the tournaments and the oaths. But beneath that glitter is a darker truth. The making of a knight began with the breaking of a child. Every victory on the field was paid for with the innocence of a boy taught to kill without a second thought, to trade mercy for survival, to believe that loyalty was worth any price, even the silence of his own conscience. And in that silence, history whispers the real story of the Middle Ages. Not just glory, but the sacrifice of humanity in service to a banner that demanded everything. Girls were taught to serve their husbands. Like saints, in the flickering glow of hearth fires and the hushed shadows of medieval cottages, girls listened to the lessons that would shape their lives long before they understood their meaning. The world they were born into belonged to men, lords, fathers, priests, husbands. Yet the burden of holiness, of sainthood, was placed on the smallest shoulders, wrapped in the sweet poison of piety and obedience. From their earliest days, girls were told stories, repeated with loving gravity by mothers, aunts, and parish priests, of women who became saints not through miracles, but through suffering. Saint Agnes, who died rather than betray her virtue. Saint Monica, who endured her husband's violence with quiet tears and endless prayers. These were not just stories. They were blueprints for a life defined by service, silence, and sacrifice. The lessons began early. While boys were sent to the fields or the forge, girls stayed at their mother's side, learning to knead dough, mend cloth, tend to the sick, and anticipate the moods of men. These skills were not just practical, they were moral, spiritual. Each act of service was taught as a kind of worship, a sacrifice pleasing to God. Girls were praised for obedience, for humility, for their willingness to place the needs of others before their own. The church itself thundered this message from the pulpit. The ideal wife was patient and silent, bearing her husband's anger as Christ bore the cross. Marriage was not just a union, but a trial. Yeah, a chance to earn grace by enduring suffering with dignity and prayer. Confessors and holy men praised the angelic wife, a woman who accepted beatings and insults without complaint, who forgave infidelity, who cared for her husband in sickness and in sin, believing that every sorrow endured brought her closer to heaven. Hagiographies, the lives of saints, were filled with these models. Girls learned that the holiest women were not warriors or queens, but brides who bent beneath the yoke of marriage and carried it, unbroken, to the grave. Martyrdom was not just the fate of those who died in colosseums. It was the everyday experience of countless wives whose pain was sanctified by legend and liturgy. In the candlelit silence of the night, mothers whispered to their daughters that happiness was not found in pleasure, but in endurance. To be a good wife was to vanish into the needs of the household, to treat a husband's anger as a test from God. Suffering, they were told, was not a curse but a path to salvation. For some, this was a comfort. Pain became meaningful, a way to transcend the limitations of their lives. For others, it was a lifelong wound. The walls of every village and manor hid secrets, bruises covered by long sleeves, weeping muffled behind doors, prayers whispered through clenched teeth. The church did not invent this suffering, but it blessed it. Priests advised girls to submit to their husbands in all things, teaching that disobedience was rebellion not only against a man, but against God's will. Confession became a place where girls learned to blame themselves for the tempers of men, to see their unhappiness as a sign of insufficient piety. In sermons, saints' lives, and confessional manuals, the message was clear. Obedience to one's husband, no matter the cost, was a holy calling. It was said that the prayers of a suffering wife could save a husband's soul, that her silent endurance was more powerful than the sword or the crown. Marriage, for most girls, was not a choice. Matches were arranged for property, for alliances, for family advantage. A girl's consent was often assumed, her future bargained away before she could fully speak her mind. Wedding ceremonies were elaborate affairs, but the vows she made were not just to her husband, but to a life of service and self-denial. The world beyond her husband's home was small, hemmed in by fear, by law, and by the ever-watchful eye of the church. To fail as a wife, to answer back, to seek happiness, to dream of more, was to risk shame, suspicion, and sometimes violence. Yet within this world, girls found their own forms of resistance and grace. Some formed bonds with mothers, sisters, and neighbors, sharing secrets and small rebellions, surviving together in a world that often seemed designed to erase them. Others turned the very language of piety to their own ends, using prayer as solace, or as a private cry for justice and relief. There were women who managed quietly and cleverly to shape their marriages and households, to wield subtle power beneath the mask of obedience. But for most, the weight of sainthood was heavy, and the tales of martyred wives pressed them into molds that not of their own making. Every village had its tales of the perfect bride, the silent sufferer, the saintly wife who endured all things. These stories did not just comfort or inspire. They warned and constrained, shaping generations of girls to serve, to endure, and to pray for the strength to bear what could not be changed. Over the centuries, as the world changed and new ideas of marriage and love emerged, the old stories lost some of their power, but their echoes remain. Even now, in the shadows of tradition, the expectation that women must suffer to be good still lingers. The saints' names have faded from household prayers, but their lessons, passed down through countless mothers and daughters, have left deep marks on the soul. The story of medieval girls, taught to serve their husbands like saints, is not just a tale of oppression. It is a record of resilience, of survival, of the quiet heroism required to endure. It is a warning too, a reminder that the stories we tell our daughters matter, that they shape the boundaries of hope and the meaning of love. For every girl who listened to tales of martyred brides and saintly wives, there was a hidden dream of something more, of a world where suffering was not sacred, and where the holiness of a woman was measured not by her pain, but by her courage to live. The saints' children feared more than they prayed to consume. In the flickering darkness of medieval homes, as rain lashed at shuttered windows and the night pressed in, children learned to fear the saints. Not the soft fear of disobedience or shadows, but a deep, bone-shaking dread. The kind that comes from stories told too often, in too much detail, with too little comfort. For in those centuries, the tales of saints were not gentle bedtime stories or lessons in kindness. They were cautionary tales dripping with blood and fire, warning children not just of the world's dangers, but of what God himself might demand. From the moment a child could listen, they heard the stories in church at the hearth, whispered by mothers and chanted by priests. These were the legends of St. Lawrence, roasted alive on an iron grate, flesh blistering as he forgave his killers. St. Bartholomew, flayed until his skin hung in tatters. St. Catherine, her body broken on the wheel, bones snapping one by one. St. Agnes, only a child herself, led to the flames because she would not renounce her faith. These were not distant, abstract martyrs. They were held up as models for every Christian soul, examples of the ultimate devotion. Parents and priests did not soften the details. See how brave they were, they would say, holding up paintings or carved icons, showing the wounds in the fire. God was with them in their pain. If you are chosen, you must be ready to suffer too. The message was clear. To be truly good was not just to pray or obey, but to be willing, if called, to endure horrors for God's sake. Children shivered as they listened, glancing at their own soft hands, wondering if someday they too might be called to the flames. In church, on feast days, the stories became spectacle. The parish priest recited the martyrdoms in the echoing darkness, the congregation silent except for the nervous breaths of children. Sometimes actors would reenact the scenes, with red paint for blood and real fire for effect. The saints' relics, bones, teeth, fragments of burned flesh, were paraded through the streets, reminders that these stories were not just legends, but events that had truly happened to people who had once been as real as the listeners themselves. At night, when the candles burned low, children lay awake, replaying the stories in their minds. The face of Saint Sebastian pierced by arrows. Saint Lucy, her eyes gouged out. Saint George, torn apart for refusing to worship false gods. Each martyr became both a warning and a threat. Love God, obey your parents, and pray for strength, because you might be asked to prove your faith in pain and death. For many children, the saints were less friends to be confided in than distant judges, watching and waiting to see if they would be brave enough. Prayers to the saints often came with a secret, desperate plea. Let me love God, but let him never test me so harshly. Let me be good, but not so good that I am chosen to suffer. In the flickering shadows of old cathedrals, some children bowed their heads not in reverence, but in fear. It is easy now to imagine the saints as gentle, smiling figures, helpers, guides, protectors. But to a child in medieval Europe, the stories were filled with iron-arched hooks, burning coals, and impossible courage. The line between sainthood and suffering was razor thin. Parents invoked the saints to frighten their children into obedience. If you steal, if you lie, if you turn away from God, you will suffer. Maybe not in this life, but in the next. Even the pictures on church walls seemed designed to terrify. Painted eyes rolling in agony, wounds opened for all to see. The tools of torture displayed like badges of faith. Some children grew up in awe of these saints, praying for their protection or asking for help in times of fear. But many others learned to pray with one eye open, hearts pounding, half dreading that the answer to their prayers would be a test too hard to bear. In the chill of winter, when hunger gnawed and sickness hovered at every door, parents would point to the martyrs and say, "They endured worse. You must be strong." These lessons shaped generations. The fear of the saints was not just a private terror, but a public expectation. A society teaching its children that the highest virtue was not peace, but the ability to suffer for faith without complaint. Even among adults, the stories haunted dreams and guided actions. A fever, a misfortune, a sudden loss was seen through the lens of martyrdom. Perhaps this was God's test. Perhaps you were being prepared for greatness through pain. The saints' stories were intended to inspire, to fortify souls against the cruelties of life and the threats of heresy. But for many children, they left scars, memories of nights spent staring at the ceiling, imagining the crackle of flames or the slice of knives, wondering if holiness was worth the price. It was only with the coming of new eras, when stories softened and the church learned to comfort as well as warn, that the saints became less terrifying, more gentle, more like friends. Yet if you walk today through the oldest cathedrals, you still see the traces, the wounds carved in stone, the flames painted on wood, the stories written into stained glass. They are reminders of a time when faith was not just a comfort, but a crucible, when sainthood was measured in suffering, and children learned to fear their saints almost as much as they prayed to them. Children were shown skulls to teach humility. You are a child, perhaps 7 or 8, and your classroom is not the bright, cheery place it was centuries later. It is a single cold room beside the church, the windows small and streaked with condensation, the benches hard and splintered beneath you. It smells of damp wool, melting wax, and old books. The priest or teacher stands at the front, the lessons mixing scripture with basic letters and numbers. But one thing dominates your memory more than any prayer or page: the skull. It sits on a shelf above the teacher's head where every child can see it, pale, smooth, its hollow eyes always watching. Some days it is set on the desk, as if it too is here to learn. Sometimes the teacher picks it up and passes it around, letting each child feel the cool, hard curve of bone, the sharpness of teeth that once belonged to someone who, like you, had hopes, fears, a family, a childhood. There is always a silence as you touch it, a stillness so deep you can hear your own heart. You are told what the skull means: memento mori, remember death. Remember that pride is dangerous, that every person, no matter how clever or beautiful or strong, becomes this in the end. It is not a threat, it is a lesson. The teacher reminds you with gentle gravity or harsh insistence that even the greatest kings return to dust, that the wise and the foolish, the just and the wicked, all leave behind only bone. No one escapes the grave. You listen, and you watch the skull as the days pass. It becomes part of your education, as natural as your slate or your primer. When you boast or disobey, the teacher only needs to point. Sometimes he lifts the skull, looking into its empty eyes, and asks what use pride or cruelty is to the dead. Sometimes during storms, when thunder rattles the glass and fear settles in your stomach, the teacher holds the skull high and says that only a humble soul will find peace in the end. You begin to wonder whose skull it was. A stranger? A villager long dead, now anonymous? You imagine it belonged to a child like yourself, or to a great sinner, or to a saint whose humility earned forgiveness. It is never explained. The mystery lingers, making the lesson sharper. The skull is everyone, and so it is you. Some children are frightened, especially at first. They have nightmares of being buried, of rising as skeletons, of the teacher's voice echoing in the dark. This is your destiny, but over time, fear changes into a kind of respect. The skull becomes a boundary you dare not cross. It stands as a warning. Pride leads to downfall, and every quarrel, every selfish act brings you closer to the fate that waits on the shelf. It is not just a Christian lesson, though it is dressed in the language of heaven and hell. In this world, humility is survival. Life is fragile. A bad harvest, a plague, a war, and you learn quickly that arrogance has no place here. The teacher uses the skull to teach more than faith. He uses it to shape your place in the village, to remind you that you are not special, not immune, not above the rules that bind everyone together. You watch as the teacher dusts the skull, speaks to it softly, sometimes with a hint of sadness. Perhaps he too needs reminding. The adults bow their heads as they pass. Even the priest, in his fine robes, sometimes places the skull on the altar during Lent, a symbol of penitence for all to see. The lesson is everywhere, painted on the church walls, carved into gravestones, whispered in the prayers for the dead. At home, your parents reinforce the lesson. When you are tempted to brag, your mother says, "Remember the skull in school." When you argue with a sibling, your father tells you, "All bones look the same in the end." You begin to sense how deeply this lesson is woven into the fabric of your world. It is not meant to crush you, but to remind you how to live well, with humility, kindness, gratitude for each day. To accept your smallness is not to despair, but to see the value in every fleeting moment. Still, the skull never quite loses its power. Even as you grow older, as lessons move from rote prayers to the slow, careful reading of scripture or legal codes, the skull remains on its shelf. Some years it is replaced, old bones swapped for new, but the message is the same. No child ever leaves the school without understanding what it means. You see it again at funerals, placed at the head of a coffin or painted on the walls of the cathedral, grinning beside saints and sinners alike. You carry the memory into adulthood. It shapes your choices, your sense of self. When fortune tempts you to pride, you remember the skull. When tragedy strikes and death comes close, you feel less afraid, having lived your childhood in its presence. The lesson becomes a shield, a way to accept the pain and brevity of life, to let go of grudges, to forgive more easily, to walk humbly with those around you. In time, you tell your own children about the skull on the shelf. You hope the lesson will live after you as it lived before you. That humility learned in the company of the dead will keep their souls light, their hearts kind, their lives meaningful, no matter how short, no matter how ordinary. Because the greatest wisdom you realize is not to fear the skull, but to understand it, to accept that every prideful moment passes, and that what remains in the end is not what you owned or proved, but how gently you lived and how humbly you loved. Death was treated as a blessing if you were pure. In the medieval world, death was never far away. It drifted in the fog that crept across village graveyards, echoed in the coughing of a sick child, haunted the anxious prayers said each night before bed. But for children raised in the shadows of churches and under the stern gaze of priests, the message was not always one of terror. Instead, they were told that if their hearts were pure, if they confessed every sin and obeyed without question, death itself could be a blessing, a swift and shining road to paradise. Imagine a time when childhood was perilous, and every fever could become a final test. The stories that parents and priests told were woven from grief and hope, meant to comfort but also to shape. "Do not fear death, little one," a mother might whisper, her hand trembling on her child's brow. "If you are good, if you pray, confess and love God, He will take you straight to heaven." Children learned this lesson as soon as they learned to walk. The world was full of rules, and even the smallest infraction weighed heavily, but so too was the promise that, with obedience and piety, death would be no punishment at all. This was no empty comfort. In every village, the memory of lost brothers and sisters hovered over the living like a quiet shadow. Death was as ordinary as rain. Graveyards were crowded with tiny stones, each one marking a life that barely had the chance to begin. For adults who had no answers, the teaching of paradise for the innocent became a necessary mercy. "God loves little children," the priest would say, standing over a tiny shrouded form. "Their souls go to Him, pure as the day they were born. Their suffering is over, and they rejoice with angels." The living clung to this hope, because to see death only as tragedy would have been too much to bear. Churches reinforced the lesson in every sermon, every mural, every song. Paintings showed radiant children held in the arms of saints, smiling in the afterlife, free from pain or hunger. Stories told of little ones who died with prayers on their lips, only to be seen by grieving parents in dreams, shining in garments of light, beckoning the living to follow the path of obedience and faith. In many abbeys, children were taught to see death as a reward, not a curse. If you kept your soul spotless, if you made your confessions and loved your neighbors, you could avoid the dangers of adult sin and enter heaven through a door that closed forever after childhood's end. The message was clear. The world is hard, but paradise is near for those who are pure. Confession became not just a ritual, but a shield against the unknown. Children rehearsed their prayers, fearing not just punishment in life, but damnation in death. Yet if they were good, their deaths would bring joy to the angels, and the grieving would be told to celebrate rather than mourn. In some villages, the funerals of children became strange mixtures of sorrow and hope. White flowers, not black, adorned the church. Bells rang in tones meant for celebration. Families clung to the idea that their loss was heaven's gain. But this belief was not without its darkness. For every story of a child's soul soaring to paradise, there were countless nights when siblings wept, confused by the joy adults seemed to find in their grief. Parents were expected to accept loss with stoic faith. Tears, yes, but also gratitude that their little one had been chosen. Some found solace. Others felt only the sharper ache of guilt, wondering if they had wished too hard for purity, too strongly for a shortcut to heaven. Yet the doctrine persisted, reinforced at every turn. When plagues swept the land and tiny bodies filled the graveyards, priests reminded the faithful, these innocents are with God. Their pain was brief, their reward eternal. The teaching worked its way into lullabies and prayers. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Children whispered these words each night, hoping that if their eyes did not open again, they would wake not in fear but in the embrace of paradise. For some, the message became twisted by fear, anxiety that a single unconfessed sin, a forgotten prayer, could bar the gates of heaven. Confession became a ritual of desperation, each child striving to keep their soul immaculate, terrified of dying unprepared. But even in this, there was a strange kind of comfort. Death was not the end, but a beginning, and a good death was the dream of every soul. So when you look back on the childhood shaped by faith and fear, remember the strange hope that softened the hardest grief. To die young and pure was not simply to be lost. It was to be found by God, to become an angel among angels. The lesson lingered in every prayer, every candle lit for the lone, every tear shed in the dark. Death waited for all, but for the innocent, it waited with open arms. This is the hidden face of the medieval obsession with death, not just dread, but longing. Not only the warning of hellfire, but the promise of a shortcut to paradise. For children who obeyed, who confessed, who prayed until their voices faded, the final sleep was transformed from a terror to a blessing, a journey home before the world had a chance to break their hearts. And so, in every quiet graveyard and every old stone church, you can still sense the hope that clung to sorrow, that for the pure, death itself was not an ending, but the brightest possible beginning. Children were told God might test them through starvation. Imagine a world where the rumbling of your stomach is more than hunger. It is a summons from heaven, a whisper that God himself is watching to see what you will do. For the children of medieval Europe, famine was never just a cruel accident of nature. It was a lesson, a trial, a sacred ordeal, one that would reveal whether you were worthy of mercy or destined to be forgotten. In the darkness of a candle-lit hovel, a family gathers around a table that is almost bare. There is a crust of bread to be divided among six, maybe a thin broth if they are lucky. The youngest child asks why there is so little to eat, why his bones show through his skin, why his mother's eyes are rimmed with worry. The answer is never simple hunger. Instead, it comes in the voice of faith. A parent explains that God sometimes withholds bounty to test the soul, to see if his children will endure, remain loyal, and suffer quietly without complaint. It is a lesson taught from the earliest years. Priests preach it from the pulpit. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. The saints, they say, suffered greater trials and were rewarded in heaven. Stories of Job and the desert prophets fill the imaginations of young listeners. If you starve well, if you accept your lot in silence, God sees you. God will remember. In church and at home, children are told that a true believer faces famine with bowed head and folded hands, not with anger or rebellion. But the reality is raw. The great famines that swept medieval Europe were not just rare disasters. They were recurring nightmares. Crops failed from blight, from endless rain, from armies trampling the fields in war. Grain rotted in storage, rats gnawed at what was left, and the rivers ran higher with each year of cold. Children saw neighbors waste away, saw friends become shadows, and still the message never changed. This is a trial. Be patient. Trust. Suffering is proof of your devotion. Parents repeated the same stories, not out of cruelty, but because it was the only way to explain the suffering that made sense. In the deepest nights, when hunger became a physical ache, mothers would hold their children and whisper that God was counting every pain, that in some distant, golden future, every empty stomach would be filled, every tear would be wiped away. Until then, you must endure. Crying was not just pointless, it was seen as weakness, as a crack in faith itself. Children learned to hide their hunger, to pretend that a few beans were enough, that the gnawing void inside was a badge of honor. They watched as their fathers left for the fields, hoping for a miracle harvest, and as their mothers divided scraps with trembling hands. Some nights, the only warmth was the story that saints and martyrs had suffered more, and that in the suffering, you became holy. The church reinforced the lesson with rituals and fasts, as if to make spiritual practice out of necessity. Lent became both a religious discipline and a way to stretch what little food remained. Children were praised for their endurance, for their silent prayers, for their willingness to go to bed hungry without complaint. A child who accepted starvation was not just a survivor. He was seen as marked by God, part of a chosen people enduring the great tests of faith. But beneath the piety, the reality was harsh and unyielding. Hunger warped the mind, stunted growth, and turned ordinary life into a battle for survival. Children watched siblings grow weak and die. Some families wandered the roads, begging or stealing, but always with the lesson pressed into their hearts. If you grumble, if you despair, you risk not only shame, but your soul's place in heaven. To break under the weight of famine was to fail the test. Those who survived carried the scars for life, not just in their bodies, but in their memories and beliefs. Many grew up to teach the same lessons to their own children. Some found solace in faith, others a bitter anger that would never quite heal. But the stories endured, echoing through the centuries. When you are hungry, God is watching. Do not protest, do not cry out. Bear it quietly, and someday you will be rewarded. In times of famine, the church bells still rang, calling the faithful to prayer. Children knelt with empty bellies, asking not for bread, but for strength to endure. And in the silence after, the world seemed unchanged, except for the new wisdom carved into every hungry heart. The lesson was not only survival, but obedience. The true cost of famine was measured not just in lives lost, but in generations taught to see their suffering as holy. Their silence as a form of worship. The fields would green again, and the tables would one day fill, but the memory remained, a shadow in every family story, a whisper in every hungry night. The test never truly ended. Even now, when we remember those dark times, we see the faces of children told to starve for God and wonder what kind of faith demands so much, and whether anyone, anywhere, was ever truly watching at all. Dreams were not private, they were messages from heaven or hell. In the candlelit darkness of the medieval world, there was no such thing as a private dream. Night after night, as sleep closed over the villages and the stone halls of monasteries, people slipped into a realm where the boundaries of body and soul blurred, and where even a child's wandering imagination was never truly their own. In these centuries, dreams were far more than a fleeting jumble of pictures. They were believed to be messages sent by powers greater than any mortal, glimpses into the invisible war between heaven and hell. And so, children were taught to listen, remember, and above all, to confess their dreams, because the soul's secret theater might be a window into its ultimate fate. For a medieval child, the dawn began not only with prayers, but with a quiet inquisition. Parents or priests would ask, "Did you dream last night?" It was not a casual question. Every strange or memorable vision was to be spoken aloud, never hidden, no matter how unsettling or trivial it seemed. The church and family alike demanded this ritual honesty, for dreams were too important, too dangerous to keep secret. In a world ruled by faith and fear, the mind's midnight journeys could reveal as much about the future or about the soul's secret battles as any sermon or confession. Sometimes a dream was simple, a vision of a departed grandparent, a walk through fields of gold, or a banquet table groaning with bread and fruit. But sometimes the dreams were darker, shadowy figures at the foot of the bed, a voice whispering terrible secrets, a sensation of flying, falling, or choking in the night. To the child who awoke trembling, there was no comfort in silence. They had been told again and again that these dreams were not private at all, but signs sent by angels or devils. The church's teachings shape the meaning of every image and every feeling. A dream of radiant light, of saints, or of the Virgin Mary was celebrated as a gift, a sign of divine favor, proof that God was near. Such dreams would be shared with pride, retold in the family or at the church door, sometimes even noted by the village priest, who might declare the dreamer especially blessed. But not all dreams brought comfort. Medieval Christianity taught that the soul was a battleground and that the devil never slept. Bad dreams, especially those filled with fear, temptation, or shadowy figures, were regarded as warnings or even attacks. The church taught that Satan and his minions could invade the mind during sleep, tempting the innocent or sowing seeds of sin. For this reason, children were told to recount nightmares in detail, sometimes before the entire household, sometimes in the confessional. A child who dreamed of violence, of monsters, or of forbidden pleasures was not merely suffering an overactive imagination, but might be under assault from hell itself. Confession and prayer were the only cures, and the pressure to reveal every detail was immense. Priests, parents, and sometimes wandering preachers took the role of dream interpreters with solemn seriousness. A good dream might lead to extra prayers of thanks, a candle offered at the shrine, or even a celebration. A bad dream was a call to repentance and vigilance. Some dreams were seen as omens for the entire family or village, predicting illness, prosperity, or disaster. There were stories of children whose dreams foretold fires, floods, or deaths, their words spreading fear or hope as they passed from mouth to mouth. Even the most private, childish fantasy could become public property, dissected and discussed, used as a warning or a promise. This constant scrutiny of dreams shaped how children understood themselves and their world. There was little room for secrets. The line between mind and soul, between the private and the public, was thin as a veil. Children learned to listen carefully to their dreams, to remember every strange image, to fear certain thoughts and hope for others. In monasteries, dreams were even used as tests of spiritual progress. Novice monks or nuns might be asked to recount their night visions, with dreams of Christ or the saints praised, and troubling dreams treated as evidence of pride or hidden sin. The confessional became a place where dreams were confessed alongside real-world transgressions, reinforcing the idea that the mind's wandering could be as significant as any spoken word or physical deed. Parents, for their part, watched and worried. A child's nightmare could send an entire family into a flurry of prayer and fasting, seeking to drive out the evil that might have crept into the house. Sometimes superstitions mingled with doctrine, an amulet hung by the bed, a prayer whispered over a cradle, the sign of the cross drawn in the air before sleep. Anything to protect the dreams, to keep the invisible world at bay. Yet beneath the fear and control, dreams could also offer a strange kind of freedom. For children trapped in hard lives, dreams were a place of escape, sometimes a rare taste of joy or power. And for a lucky few, the telling of a dream could grant them a moment of attention, a kind of importance rarely found in daylight. The village might listen, the priest might bless, and for a heartbeat, a child's secret world became everyone's concern. But the price of this attention was high. To be suspected of harboring evil dreams, or to have one's night visions judged sinful, was to carry a burden of guilt and fear. The world of dreams was never entirely safe. The boundaries between inner and outer, between sin and innocence, were policed as closely in sleep as in waking life. As the centuries turned and ideas changed, dreams became private once more, reclaimed by the mind's silence. But in those long centuries of faith and fear, every child learned this unspoken lesson, that the soul's secrets were never truly their own, and that in the darkness behind closed eyes, heaven and hell watched and waited for what the dreamer might reveal. Loyalty to God meant betraying your own doubts. In the quiet shadows of candlelit chapels, behind thick monastery walls and within every stone cottage, the rules of faith seeped into a child's mind with the certainty of the seasons. To be loyal to God was not simply to pray or to obey the commandments, but to silence even the faintest ripple of doubt in one's own heart. Doubt, they were told, was not just weakness, it was danger. A whisper from the devil himself, a seed that could destroy families, villages, souls. In a world where every misfortune, failed harvest, sudden illness, a child's death, was seen as punishment or test, even a stray question could be a risk too great to bear. Children learn this lesson early, their minds shaped by the words of priests, parents, and elders. In the village square, the priest's voice rang out clear and stern. Obedience is faith. Question, and you betray not only your family, but God himself. At home, mothers pressed their hands to their children's heads, blessing them with oil and whispered prayers, urging them to confess every dark or doubting thought. The devil is cunning, they warned. He slips into your dreams, your questions, your secret fears. There was no room for uncertainty. Rules were not explained but accepted. Why must you kneel at sunrise? Why is bread forbidden on this day? Why does the priest alone read the sacred words? The answer was always the same. Because it is God's will. To question is to stray from the path. Any child bold enough to ask why would see the fear flicker in their mother's eyes, the anger in a father's voice. Better to stay silent, better to smile and nod, even when your heart trembled with confusion. At school, the lessons were sharper. The old master might catch a child pausing over a catechism, lips moving uncertainly. Are you doubting? He would demand, cane tapping on the desk. The devil waits in doubt. Punishments for defiance were swift, but for questions, they could be even more severe. A week spent kneeling on stone, reciting prayers until knees bled and the mind numbed, until the child's voice was hoarse and every thought seemed a betrayal. Confession was a constant, expected rhythm. Children were taught to search their own hearts, to expose every stray suspicion or secret uncertainty before God. At the confessional grate, they whispered not just sins of action, but sins of thought. I wondered if the story was true. I doubted the miracle. I asked why my friend had to die. The priest's voice, low and grave, warned them, to doubt is to invite the devil. You must trust without question. Pray for forgiveness and think no more. Even in play, children policed one another. If a friend hesitated before crossing themselves or fumbled a prayer, others would whisper, be careful. God is watching. The devil hears what you're thinking. Doubt became not just a private fear, but a public shame. Rumors grew like weeds, that the boy who asked questions at Mass had brought the storm that ruined the harvest, that the girl who stammered during confession was cursed. Suspicion poisoned childhood friendships. The world was a maze of invisible dangers, and every misstep could lead to ruin. Inside, the cost was greater still. Children learned to turn on their own thoughts, to watch their minds as if they were their worst enemies. At night, when questions surfaced, about suffering, about God's silence, about rules that made no sense, they fought to push them down, to pray until sleep or exhaustion won out. Some learned to lie even in confession, hiding their doubts because the shame of admitting them felt worse than the fear itself. Others broke under the pressure, their spirits bent by the impossible command to trust absolutely, to erase the most human of instincts, the urge to wonder. The saints were no help either. Their stories, tales of men and women who never questioned, who faced fire and torture with unshakable faith, only deepened the sense of failure in those who wavered. The lesson was clear. The closer you came to doubt, the further you fell from grace. Even a single question could cost you heaven itself. Yet, beneath all this, the world still shimmered with questions. The stars wheeled overhead, mysteries blooming in the night. The sick were sometimes healed, sometimes not. Bad things happened to good people, no matter how hard they prayed. Sometimes, in secret, an old grandmother might whisper, "It's all right to wonder, but don't let them see. God knows your heart." But most children learn to keep their doubts hidden, locked behind careful smiles and perfect prayers, hoping that was enough. The legacy of that fear lingered for generations. Even as new ideas slowly crept in and the world changed, the old lesson remained, that loyalty to God meant betraying your own doubts, that trust was proven in silence, and that the cost of a single question could be eternal. The echo of those warnings can still be heard in whispered prayers, in uneasy silences, in the shadow that falls whenever a child wonders, just for a moment, whether all the rules truly make sense. This is the mark left by centuries of teaching that doubt was dangerous. In a world hungry for certainty, faith was measured not in love or understanding, but in how completely you could turn away from the small, honest voice inside. For the children of that age, the greatest test was not facing the world's cruelties, but learning to distrust themselves, to smother every question, to live in a faith so absolute that even their own thoughts became suspect. And for many, that struggle, to believe, to silence, to obey, never truly ended.